and I hope you're all ready to go and talk about meta-analysis. I love talking about meta-analysis, and hopefully you all will enjoy it as well. So we all ready to jump in? Yeah. All right, thumbs up. Okay. So we'll jump in, and one of the ways I like to start talking about meta-analysis is actually by starting at the end. um, in a sense, this is where we're headed. I mean, now there's more to it than this, of course, but a common sort of output from meta-analysis is a forest plot, unless it's a really big meta-analysis where the focus is just on meta regression models and things of that nature. But a common sort of output is a forest plot, and getting to this point. And so this is what we're going to be working towards in a lot of ways. And what you see here, this is based off of something I did now, gosh, 25 years ago, maybe. And it's cognitive behavioral programs for adult offenders. These are group-based programs, and the outcome is recidivism, and what we see here are 9 different studies. So each row is a study with the author, label, and year. And the line in there, that center little square, is the observed effect size. The horizontal line is the 95% confidence interval. And then at the bottom we have a diamond representing the random effects model, where the sort of the center of that diamond is the effect, and the width of the diamond is the 95% confidence interval. Now, I like this particular forest plot. I haven't, I continue to use it even though it's old, because it shows some interesting sort of properties. If you recall from statistics, I assume all of you know that if a 95% confidence interval includes sort of the null value, in this case 0, it's not statistically significant, right? And so we can see here that 7 of these 9 studies had a statistically non-significant effect. 2 of them had significant positive effects, but one of those is sort of a bit of an outlier with a rather large effect, but it also has a really large confidence interval, which indicates that it was sort of a small sample size study, not a very precise estimate. Matter of fact, the bottom end of that confidence interval overlaps with a lot of the other confidence intervals. Now, and at the bottom, the overall mean effect size, however, is positive and statistically significant. It's a standardized mean difference of 0.2. If you don't know what that is, you will by the end of today. And that's sort of considered a small effect, but it is statistically significant. What I like to point out is if we had approached this literature as a narrative review, right? So we'd not done a meta-analysis, we would have noticed that 7 of the studies did not have statistically significant effects, but 2 did. And so we would either conclude that the evidence is weak and inconclusive. We might, depending on our temperament, we might say, well, it's promising because 2 studies found a significant result, but we would probably be fairly pessimistic about the benefits of these cognitive behavioral programs. But when we take a meta-analytic lens to look at these, we're focused on the size of the effects and the pattern and direction of the effects. Now, notice that all of the effects are positive. I mean, one is really close to the null value, but they're all on the positive side of the distribution. If these programs were on average non-significant, if on average these programs didn't work, produced no meaningful effect, we would expect these effect sizes to bounce around on both sides of the null value. Some would be positive, some would be negative. The fact that the pattern of the evidence is all positive is is suggestive that these programs are beneficial, and that's what meta-analysis is doing. It's looking at the size of the effects, the direction of the effects, and also the precision, right? So some of these are more precise, have smaller confidence intervals, um, uh, and all of that information is built into the calculation of that overall weight. And I think this gives us a much better sort of summary of what's going on in the literature. And also just this visual display is quite helpful and far more informative than any focus on statistical significance. Okay, so that's sort of, big picture, of where we're headed. So now let's jump into sort of thinking about overview of the meta-analysis of the workshop. Excuse me, I have to apologize. This is probably the worst week for allergies for me, and so unfortunately, I'll occasionally have to blow my nose and I'm a little congested. Um, so this is sort of an overview of what we're going to do over the next 3 days. I'm going to start with some historical background. I think it's useful and informative. Then I'm going to focus on talking about the logic meta-analysis. So I was just talking about some of that just now. And then we'll dig into the effect sizes, right? Because you can't do a meta-analysis without effect sizes. We'll talk about some of the common types and then we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of two of the most common, the standardized mean difference and the odds ratio slash risk ratio. Um, the third most common would be the correlation coefficient, but usually there's no issues in calculating it because it's usually just reported in the studies that you're coding. And then we'll get into just sort of doing a basic meta-analysis, basically sort of what we were looking at on the prior page, that I would consider that just a basic meta-analysis, nothing fancy, right? Just an overall a mean effect size, confidence interval, and related sort of statistics. And then we'll get into measures of heterogeneity. How do we assess the variability, the inconsistency in results across studies, and there's several ways of doing that. And then we'll dig into the differences between random effects and fixed effects. We're going to start by learning how to do fixed effects, but then I'm going to tell you, yeah, but you're almost never going to do fixed effects. The default should almost always be a random effects model. But it's hard to sort of start there, right? Because the random effects builds on top of the fixed effects. Matter of fact, you have to estimate the fixed effects model first to be able to estimate the random effects models. Um, uh, and then we're going to get into moderator analysis, right? And this is the fun stuff, particularly if your meta-analysis is not real small, but a lot of the meta-analyses in the social sciences, for example, have quite a few studies, and you want to explore whether or not characteristics of the study explain variability in effect sizes, explain some of that heterogeneity. And there's two main approaches there: a categorical approach that's called an analog to the ANOVA. Some people just call it subgroup meta-analysis, and then there's meta-analytic regression, and we're gonna dig into both of those. Then we'll talk about how to generate forest plots, how to produce them in software, and some of the variations that you might things that you can include, variations in how you generate them. Then we're going to talk about publication bias. We'll actually talk about that some, I think, early on, but then we'll dig into, I have a section on it. So how do we assess publication selection bias? What is it? How do we try to minimize it, et cetera. And then finally, we're going to talk about some cutting edge methods. I'm going to introduce you to network meta-analysis and robust standard errors for statistically dependent effect sizes. This one actually is really quite a really important advance in meta-analysis and allows us to include multiple effect sizes per study in a single analysis, which particularly in the social sciences is almost always the case. Less true in medical meta-analyses where they'll often have a single outcome of interest that's measured pretty much the same way in all the studies and only measured once. And then I'll talk some about sort of meta-analyzing regression coefficients, or even doing fully multivariate models, like meta-analyzing structural equation models or factor analysis, for example. There are ways to do that with meta-analysis. So that's the overview of the next 3 days. I'm hoping that's what you thought you were signing up for. I think this is what was described in the description of the course, but this is sort of our plan. Okay, so let's jump in. And please remember to interrupt me if you have a question. Um, One can actually tell several different histories of meta-analysis, because it essentially was sort of like a good idea that was bound to emerge, and did sort of emerge somewhat independently in more than one place. But as a psychologist, I'm most familiar with sort of the emergence in psychology, and that's really where it emerged earliest in its full form. So psychology was really the leader in this area. Even though now I sometimes, when I'm talking to people, socially and whatnot, and they ask what I do, and I say I do meta-analysis, and they say, "Oh, that thing that they do in medicine," right? It's like, well, no, really, as psychologists, we sort of really led the way initially, but part of what led to it, at least one sort of a story of its emergence, and where the term meta-analysis comes from, is in 1952, Hans Eysenck, a British a psychiatrist, did a review of the literature on the effectiveness of psychotherapy. And I don't remember how many studies he reviewed. It was maybe 200 and some, right? But it was just a narrative review. He collected together all the studies that he could find, and he read them all, and he pronounced that psychotherapy doesn't work based on his reading of the literature. This did not sit well with clinical psychologists, who thought that he was wrong, and so they got very busy doing, basically clinical trials, lots of experiments, some sort of not quite experiments, but comparison group studies on the effectiveness of psychotherapy. And the body of literature started to grow and grow. And every time people did narrative reviews, they discovered that, well, studies disagree. Some find statistically significant effects, some don't. The results are equivocal. We need more studies. And so this body of equivocal evidence just kept growing. And of course, the evidence never, when you have a mix of non-significant and significant, you're not going to, that's just going to continue to occur. Um, and Gene Glass, who actually had struggled with depression and had felt like he really had benefited from psychotherapy and helping him deal with his struggles with depression, he and his wife, Mary Lee Smith, they decided to approach uh, sort of reviewing the evidence as a research task in its own right, right? Treat it like a study, and extract effect sizes. And this sort of work sort of flowed out of Jacob Cohen's Statistical Power Book, 1968, that established Cohen's D. And Glass felt like, I can take advantage of this thing called an effect size. And if I calculate it on all of these studies, I could then treat that as a database and analyze it. Now, his statistical approach was not very sophisticated. He just treated it like regular data. But it was still pretty cool, and showed a very beneficial effect to psychotherapy. I'm about to sneeze, I think. Um, and Gene Glass is the one responsible for then coining the term meta-analysis. And this was in the late 1970s. But the statistical foundations for meta-analysis are actually much older. And there was actually a study in 1904 by Carl Pearson, yes, the guy who created the correlation coefficient, where he averaged correlations between inoculation for typhoid fever and mortality. And there were a collection of maybe 10 or so studies, and he calculated the tetrachord correlation, but not the Pearson's, rather interesting, late, but the tetra and averaged those correlations across studies, weighting by sample size, and showed that inoculation for typhoid fever does in fact reduce mortality. Because at the time, the medical community was very skeptical of inoculations and vaccines. And and looking at the individual studies, the results were mixed. But when he averaged them, it showed a clear picture of benefit for the value of the inoculations. And in a sense, we would call what he did in 1904 a meta-analysis, right? So one of the earlier meta-analysis. R.A. Fisher, who we get our randomized control designs, the ANOVA, and a lot of things in statistics. He recognized in his writings that you might have a set of independent studies that individually would not be significant, yet the aggregate might be implausible. And this is like that first force plot, right? I mean, he recognized that, wait, you could have where each study is not statistically significant, but they're all um, going in the same direction. And that the probability that you would have 7 out of 9 studies that all had positive results, that might be a fairly low statistical probability. And so he actually came up with this idea of sort of aggregating p-values. We don't do that anymore. There's a lot of problems with it, but it's part of that thinking meta-analytically rather than just focusing on all of the discrete tests. In a biostatistician in medicine, W.G. Cochran, developed methods for averaging means across studies. And the statistical methods that Cochran developed are the basis for our modern approach to inverse variance weighted meta-analysis. One of my doctoral professors, Alan Wicker, some of his early work, he averaged correlations in social psychology between attitudes and behavior. A big debate in social psychology is why attitudes don't predict behavior better. We often sort of have share attitudes about something, but our behavior is not always consistent with that. And he did what we would now consider to be a meta-analysis. But at the time that Smith and Glass published their psychotherapy piece in 1977, around that time, two other major publications came out from psychologists that essentially were also meta-analyses. There was Hunter and Schmidt's um, validity generalization work in 1977, which was looking at the predictive validity of employment tests. And so that's where the validity comes from. And they were looking to see whether or not the validity of those tests generalize across settings, hence validity generalization. And Rob Rosenthal and Donald Rubin at Harvard did essentially what we would call a meta-analysis of interpersonal expectancy effects in psychological research. Each three of these people use slightly different statistical methods, but it's all, it sort of shows that in the late 70s, the idea of meta-analysis was just ready to sort of pop. Um, yeah, let's see, anything else? Yeah. And at this time in the late 70s, the medical community was really had not yet started to embrace these methods. Um, so let's think about the logic. So I've hinted at the logic some in my discussion of that forest plot, but there's more to it than that. Some of the problems with sort of your traditional narrative review um, is one that it tends to focus on statistical significance. And there's value in statistical significance. It helps protect us against getting excited about results that we shouldn't be excited about. And actually, just a second, it looks like there might be things in the chat that I haven't seen. Okay. Nothing I need to deal with. Okay, great. Um, So the narrative review focused on statistical significance. And while it's useful in helping us not get too excited about the results in our own study, that those results might be due to chance, it actually is not real useful once we start trying to make sense of results across a collection of studies. Um, the the other problem with narrative reviews in their traditional form is that they lack transparency and replicability. They didn't have the things that we now associate with a systematic review. A clear eligibility criteria, extensive search of the literature to try to identify all eligible studies, um, a replicable a replicable method of extracting information from those studies, some method of drawing inferences that isn't just, I'm a scholar, I read this stuff, this is my pronouncement, my assessment of this literature. Now, if we think about statistical significance a little bit more, part of the reason it's problematic um, is that there's an asymmetry between statistically significant results and non-significant results, right? So a statistically significant effect, I would call that a strong conclusion, or at least we know the strength of that conclusion, right? If our a priori p-value that we would reject the null at was 0.05, then we know that the probability that we're drawing an incorrect inference is 0.05 or less, assuming that the study's of high quality and we did our statistics correctly. So we have a sense of our how confident we can be in those results. But a non-significant effect is a weak conclusion. Remember, in statistics, first semester of statistics, you were taught and then may have sort of gotten sloppy and forgot it. But when the results are non-significant, that doesn't mean the null is true. Remember, we fail to reject the null. Right. We don't accept the null. And so it doesn't mean that that there's no effect. It simply means we don't know, or there's not sufficient evidence to reject the null. So you now have, if you're looking at a collection of studies, some have statistically significant results, some have null findings, and maybe some have statistically significant negative results. So you have maybe a mix of all three. Um, how do you balance those, right? What kind of mental calculus do you do to balance non-significant results with significant results? And in a sense, the answer is you don't. There is no way to sort of balance statistically significant and statistically non-significant results if you're only focusing on p-values. Meta-analysis solves this problem by shifting the focus away from significance and focuses then on sort of the direction and magnitude of the effect. Um, uh, and it also then says, our approach to reviewing the literature should be like any other piece of research, right? So it should be transparent. It should be replicable. It should use credible methods. And so all of those things that now we associate with the term systematic review, but sort of emerged out of the writings within the meta-analytic community of how to go about reviewing the literature in a credible way that represents quality research as opposed to just scholarship, right? And so then if we think about, well, we've got a collection of studies, what are we most interested in? In a sense, we can think about sort of three categories of things. We're interested in an average effect, or maybe average effects for certain categories of things. We're interested in the consistency of the effects. How consistent are the results across studies? Right? Or are the studies telling us very different things? And then hopefully we can maybe explore the relationship between study features and those effects that we've observed. And that's basically, meta-analysis in a nutshell is all of the statistical methods for doing this, for approaching the synthesis task as a research endeavor. So having all of those ideas of replicability, reliability, credible methods, and then when we're looking at the results, doing something that allows us to look at both the average effect, but also the pattern of evidence and and exploring any inconsistency in the evidence. Okay. Deep breath. Now, we heard from a couple of people at the beginning who were doing meta-analyses on very different sorts of topics. And so if we want to think about, what kind of research is suitable for meta-analysis? Now, hopefully, it's obvious that it needs to be quantitative in the sense that it needs to produce statistical results. Right? But beyond that, there's not many restrictions, right? We can meta-analyze a pretty broad range of literatures and design types. Now, we want a certain amount of sort of consistency within a meta-analysis, right? But um, there's all kinds of different literatures that can be meta-analyzed. And what's interesting when I teach workshops, when I talk to people about meta-analysis, they often have a fairly restricted view of meta-analysis based on their disciplinary background. So I've talked to some people who really think of meta-analysis only as something you do for correlational studies. And I've talked to other people who only think about meta-analysis in terms of randomized controlled trials, right? And that meta-analysis is just about that. But it's about both those and more. So if we think about um, some categories, one category that might not be immediately obvious is central tendency research, because we think about effect sizes, which makes us think about group contrasts, and people think that the word effect size implies causation, cause and effect, and really we don't. By effect size, we just mean our statistical parameter of interest, right? And so central tendency research could be things like prevalence rates, right? So you could think about, well, I had a doctoral student who synthesized the prevalence rates of chlamydia um, among incarcerated youth. So youth in juvenile detention facilities, and synthesizing, and I was surprised. There's a whole collection of epidemiological studies just calculating the prevalence rate of chlamydia among that population and showing that it's significantly higher than it is in the general population. And so you can meta-analyze prevalence rates, epidemiological studies where it's just a rate that you're interested in. Um, you might have one group pre-post contrasts. Those are also possible to do, sort of change over time. Thinking, say, longitudinal estimates of change over time that one could look at. Um, now, a big area for meta-analysis is sort of group contrast, and I'm distinguishing here between two different types of group contrast. One could have group contrast for naturally occurring groups, for example, comparing boys and girls. Betsy Becker, a big name in meta-analysis, one of her early meta-analyses was looking at differences in SAT quantitative scores, math scores between boys and girls, and looking at that difference. And then, of course, group contrasts, what a lot of people think about are sort of experiments, sort of treatment versus control. But it could also be sort of your treatment versus treatment sort of studies, or factorial design studies in psychology. But sort of the common example here is your sort of your randomized controlled trial, a drug versus placebo condition, or cognitive behavioral therapy versus routine no treatment or routine treatment, for example. But we're not done yet. Some of the Ahmet, for example, I think at the beginning, was talking about his work, and we didn't delve into all the details, but I assume that he was meta-analyzing correlations, right? And that these were correlational studies. We can think of sort of cross-section correlational studies. It could be also longitudinal correlational studies. I'm not sure why I restricted this to cross-sectional. You could have other sorts of correlational studies, but think about sort of research designs that generate correlation coefficients, right? And you can meta-analyze those correlation coefficients. So observational research, naturally occurring research. Of various kinds. And typically those studies would measure a whole bunch of things, and you might have a whole correlation matrix, but typically your interest might be one or two of those correlations from that matrix that you would code across studies. um, Regression models. Now, this gets a little more difficult, but you can sort of meta-analyze the results from regression models. Generally, when you're doing this, there's sort of um, a focal coefficient of interest. Uh, and so one example, I did a meta-analysis of observational studies of police. And there's a whole bunch of studies that people have done, well, a whole bunch, 20 some, of police ride-alongs, researchers riding along with police. And every time there's a police citizen encounter, they code characteristics of that encounter, um, and including sort of the perceived race of the citizen and whether or not an arrest was made, right? And then there are these regression models, and they have all sorts of variables, all kinds of characteristics of the encounter that they've coded, but the model will have this one variable of race, whether the person, whether the citizen was a person of color or not, for example. And then they're predicting whether or not an arrest was made. And so it was that focal correlation that, or logistic regression coefficient in this case, that was of interest. And so I extracted those coefficients of interest and coded all sorts of characteristics about sort of what variables were included in the model, right? And then meta-analyzed that, and then used variations in the models as moderator variables. Analyses. For example, one of the theories in the literature was that the race effect was confounded with demeanor, the demeanor of the citizen, how sort of hostile or aggressive the citizen was. And that's not supposed to influence whether a police officer makes an arrest, but the argument was, well, that's what's influencing them and not the person's race. And rather interestingly, there was, a lot of the studies then included demeanor, but some didn't. And there was no difference between the coefficients that were adjusted for demeanor versus the coefficients that were not adjusted for demeanor, which really sort of undermined that argument. And yes, and we did find an effect that once you control for other sort of observable characteristics of the interaction, there is still a significant sort of racial effect. Okay, and so you can think of this is one area where economists have started getting into meta-analysis, and they're synthesizing econometric regression models, and sort of extracting. Usually, they focus on the unstandardized regression coefficient, or there's a lot of work being done by T.D. Stanley, Tom Stanley, in this area. And he actually likes to use the partial correlation, so the correlation adjusted for the other variables in the model, because it's easy to calculate from the reported information. You can calculate that from the t-test. I I see the advantages of that, but I actually prefer the unstandardized regression coefficient for reasons that if any of you are particularly interested in that, we can discuss that later, like on Saturday. Um, Measurement, psychometric research. If you think about a lot of the stuff of Hunter and Schmidt, they're interested in the predictive validity, and in that context, they're of course then looking at correlation coefficients. But I've listed this separately. That whole approach to meta-analysis has now sort of been labeled psychometric meta-analysis, because generally it's being applied to studies that are looking at the psychometric qualities of measures. It's also possible, and this is sort of an interesting area. There aren't a lot of examples, but of fully multivariate meta-analysis. So things like structural equation modeling, factor analysis. I've kind of always wanted to do one of these things. I just haven't found the right sort of topic that's sort of in my orbit of substantive interest. The general idea here, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on Saturday, is that essentially you meta-analyze the correlation matrices, the full matrices, and then you end up with a synthesized matrix. And once you have a correlation matrix, you can run your own factor analysis, structural equation modeling, et cetera. And Mike Choung is the big person there. He's written a book on it and a great R package, and he's really the expert in that area. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to just talk about a little bit about the concept of effect size without getting into the details of coding them and the specific types, and some essential features, and then talk about some systematic review stuff, searching for studies, coding studies, that sort of stuff. And then we'll jump into the nitty-gritty of calculating effect sizes. So this next couple of slides is just sort of big picture stuff. But if you're wanting the nitty gritty, we will get there. We will get there. But I want to make sure everyone's properly oriented. So when we think about the effect size, it's what makes meta-analysis possible. And we were just talking about sort of the panel designs. How would you do a meta-analysis? Well, you got to come up with an effect size, right? And if you can come up with an effect size that represents the statistical parameter of interest that you want to extract from those studies, then you're golden, right? And so we can also think of the effect size as sort of our dependent variable, the dependent variable of a meta-analysis, thing that we predict in our moderator analyses. It's that. And when we think about it, and generally, it has to sort of standardize findings across studies such that they can be directly compared. So whatever statistic we extract, it has to be on the same scale across studies. And we usually do that through standardization. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to standardize. There might be some topics where things are always measured the same way, and things are already on the same scale across studies, in which case you wouldn't necessarily need to standardize. But standardization is almost always needed. Because whatever you calculate, you want to be able to say that these are comparable. And so, as I've said several times this morning already, that this term effect size, we're using it sort of generically. So any standardized index can be an effect size. So a standardized mean difference, a correlation coefficient, odds ratio, a prevalence rate, standardized regression coefficient, all sorts of things can be an effect size. But we need a couple of characteristics. So we've already sort of said it needs to be comparable across studies, which generally requires standardization. And it represents the magnitude and direction of interest. So it has to be directional. I've seen some people try to meta-analyze things like R squared, which is non-directional, or Kramer's V, right, which is the correlation that is the relationship in a contingency table, but it's nonlinear, right, and it's non-directional. So there sort of has to be a directionality to it. Otherwise, hopefully it makes intuitive sense that it doesn't make sense. I mean, if we had, well, yeah, I mean, here would be one way to think about it. Let's say we have back to the example of sort of race and arrest. But now all of the studies are have say four or five, 3 to 5 categories of arrest. Not of arrest, of race, ethnicity, and arrest, and they calculate sort of a Kramer's V. So what's the relationship between race and arrest? Well, the you that Kramer's V doesn't tell you whether it's um, which group is higher and which group is lower. And it might be in one study, African Americans have the highest probability of arrest. In another study, it might be individuals who are Hispanic. And maybe in another, for some weird reason, it might be white Caucasians, right? And and so if you just had this non-directional thing that just there's a relationship, you're getting these very different results across. It really doesn't sort of make sense, right? You need to break it down to something where there's sort of directionality. Um, and we want our index to be independent of sample size. And by this, I mean that it's not a direct mathematical function of sample size. So like a t-test, for example, is a direct function of sample size. The same mean difference. If you increase the sample size, the t-test gets bigger, even though the effect remains the same. So just changing the sample size changes that. But if you think like about a correlation coefficient, if you take the same data, but just sort of double the sample size, the correlation coefficient stays the same. Right? Cohen's d stays the same, even if you like doubled the sample sizes, right? So we want it to be independent of sample size, because sample size doesn't reflect the phenomena of interest, right? It's a decision on the part of the researcher. Um, okay. Um, so that's just sort of conceptually at a big picture, and we will dig into the nuts and bolts. Um, so meta-analysis as a systematic review. Um, So the early days of meta-analysis, this term systematic review didn't exist. But the early meta-analytic literature, that in the 80s and early 90s, was really talking about all of these issues about having really clear eligibility criteria, doing a systematic search and all of this stuff. And then people realized, well, sometimes I can't actually do a meta-analysis on this topic for statistical reasons. They can't get an effect size, right, that's comparable across studies. But they still want to adopt this approach to making sense of the literature. They want to be systematic about it. They want to do all of these things. And so they created this other term called systematic reviewing. Um, and so now there's sort of become this bifurcation that meta-analysis is starting to mean just the statistical methods, and systematic review, all of these other methods. But I think that, in this course, we're going to talk some about this systematic review stuff. So it's because it's key to a quality meta-analysis. It's sort of part of the part of all of the things that you're going to do when you're going to do a meta-analysis. You need it needs to be it needs to also be a systematic review. So you need an explicit inclusion exclusion criteria. And just a sec, I'm going to flip some slides here to see if I've got, okay. Yeah, sometimes I then have follow-up slides for each one of the points, but I have a tendency to then say everything that's on those slides before I go to them, but I don't. Here I just have these. The one of the problems I see most with inclusion exclusion criteria is they're not sufficiently detailed. Particularly in written up journal articles. The entire inclusion exclusion criteria will be a short paragraph, right? And for the whole thing. And you really need, now there might be some situations where that's enough, but you really need to fully flesh out, the characteristics of the studies that are eligible and things that would make studies ineligible. And so it's not enough to just say, uh, the studies needed to have samples of juveniles. Well, what do we mean by juveniles? What's the age range? What if a study is 90% juveniles, but they have a small percentage of 18 to 21-year-olds? Is that in or is that out, right? You're going to have to make that fairly clear and explicit. If it's a treatment effectiveness one, what are the essential characteristics of the treatment? What are the essential characteristics of the comparison? This is where in the medical community, we've come up with the term PICO. The population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome. But you also need the design, right? And you might need some other things. And these need to be fairly explicit and well articulated. Matter of fact, if when you're doing this, if you and your fellow people who are working on this have a lot of disagreements about whether studies are in or not, that probably means you haven't fleshed out the inclusion exclusion criteria in sufficient detail. I usually have sort of a full paragraph for each thing. So a paragraph on research design. So for example, it's not enough to just say, I'm going to include quasi-experimental designs. That's a huge category. And different people have different interpretations of what's meant by quasi-experimental. Some people think quasi-experimental means comparison group designs. But I think of quasi-experimental as including interrupted time series, pre-post studies, and other things that some people don't include in their definition of quasi-experimental. So you really need to explain and define all of the terms, including sort of the essential design elements. If it's correlational study, it's a little easier. There are fewer things to explain, but what are the characteristics of the population, the sampling method, and the measures, right? And what measures were collected, how were those collected, how are those constructs measured, and is what they measured, is that a construct that's eligible or not? You also need to do an exhaustive search for all eligible studies. And by eligible, that means whether they're published or not. We have and we're going to talk either, I don't know whether it pops up late tomorrow or early Saturday, publication bias. But the peer-reviewed literature is biased towards significant findings, so it's important to search for what's called the gray literature, less formally published stuff, conference presentations, unpublished manuscripts, technical reports from grants that aren't necessarily published. But you need an exhaustive search. It's searching a single database like PubMed. Now, in medicine, you can maybe get away with that, but in the social sciences, you have to search lots of different databases. I just peer-reviewed something in criminology where they only searched Web of Science. Well, Web of Science has actually pretty poor coverage of criminology journals. They maybe have no more than 20% of the criminology journals, right? And so in my area, I mean, I have a list of about probably 20 databases I search, including unpublished things like NCJRS, National Criminal Justice uh, Research Service. In education, you'd be wanting to search ERIC, right? And you want to search dissertations. Dissertations are a great source of unpublished literature, right? And so you would, a quality search includes searching multiple databases. You might think, oh, they should all be tapping into the same thing, but you'd be surprised at how much unique stuff you get when you search other databases. So you get on your library and you look at all the databases and you think, which databases might have at least some literature in my area, and then you should search that. Good searches not often also include sort of harvesting references from eligible studies. So eligible studies, you often look through their their reference lists to see about things that you might not have found otherwise. You can also sort of email researchers in the field. It's become a lot easier to search conference abstracts. So, for conferences in the topic area, you can search those and contact the researchers to get presentations or published or manuscripts or published articles. Um, I find that the search process is often at least a third of the effort of the total meta-analytic process. It's a lot of work doing an exhaustive search. Um, there are some great tools. I'm trying to think. There's some great data online tools like Rayanne is one right now. Let me try to pull up Rayanne. Um, Now you guys are seeing this website that I've pulled up. Sometimes I do
Yes.
things
Yes.
and people don't see it. So Rayanne, let me sign into my account. Oops. Uh, uh, do it later. Yeah. Um, let's see if I can get into one of these. Whoops. Okay, what this is for, I was trying to pull up my review. Rayanne lets you, uh, maybe I need to click on that. Okay, my grad student created this and it's now been archived and you won't, but you can import your search into here and um, so from the various databases. So when you search the various databases, you want to download and export all of the hits. Um, and uh, you would then import them in here, and you can then go through and you can very quickly click that it's potentially eligible. It's something you want to get the PDF and look at. It's to exclude it, or you can click question mark, and you would usually have two coders go through and do this and resolve any disagreements. Um, and it makes it a lot sort of easier. I would recommend if you don't have experience doing this, there are um, librarians who have specialized in searches for systematic reviews and can really help you develop an effective search strategy. Um, and you also um, want to develop a systematic method of coding and data extraction. I've got some slides later that I'm going to talk about developing coding forms, so I won't say too much here. But you actually want sort of coding forms, sort of like doing a survey, and you're going to survey each study and extract information into structured data forms. Um, uh, uh, and I'm going to encourage you. I mentioned using Excel. I will encourage you to avoid Excel for doing this, though a lot of people still use Excel for uh, doing their meta-analyses, at least for their coding. I recommend other approaches. You almost always want to have some assessment of study quality. If you're working in the medical field, Cochrane, they've coined the term risk of bias. And so if you're doing anything that's sort of an effectiveness review or something looking at a causal effect, you're going to want to assess internal validity, the threats to the causal interpretation. But even studies that are like purely correlational, you might want to be assessing the quality of the sampling methods, the quality of the measures, the quality, how well the measurement constructs reflect the construct that you want, and so there are almost always some sort of quality measures that you're going to want to incorporate into your review. I recommend avoiding just a single quality index. In criminology, there's a popular scale, the Maryland the Maryland scientific scale, or the scale of method quality from Maryland, something like that. It's just a 5-point scale, and which is not sufficiently differentiated. You really want to think about what are the different quality dimensions of studies in my literature, and have questions that tap into variability in designs. And then, a good systematic review will also, use some replicable way of drawing inferences across evidence. Ideally, this would be using meta-analysis. Sometimes meta-analysis is not possible. You would still want to do something that is transparent and credible. Let's see, just a second. There's a in the chat. So there's a question about, let me stop sharing at this point, about using AI to help with the literature searches. Yes, there's another, this Rayanne does have some built-in AI. And after you've screened a certain number, you can ask it to sort of rate everything else, and it'll then start giving you the stuff that it thinks has a higher probability, or it sort of gives things a probability. I used it. It was fairly good. It helped get it so that when I was looking at the high probability stuff, it was much more likely. But I still ultimately went through all of it. There's another program called Abstractar, out of University of Brown University. Sorry, Brown University, and it has a really pretty good AI built into it. But the program tends to be a bit buggy unless they've updated it recently. I don't know if they're still actively working on it. But I was pretty impressed with that AI once. There's also a commercial package called Distiller, which is for both coding studies and for screening, and it has an AI built in. I've not used it. The debate is, at what point do you stop, right? And so these AIs, they'll never get to the point where they say we're 100% confident there are no more eligible studies, right? But they'll often get to a point where they'll say, hey, we're 98% certain that the stuff that you haven't screened, nothing's relevant. And you have to decide, is that good enough or not? And for those of you who don't realize it, hopefully what I maybe sort of skipped over it. The way these things work is that as you code studies, it sort of learns which studies you're saying are eligible or not, and it starts trying to predict um, um, what studies it thinks will be eligible. And it'll then start sorting the studies where the things that it thinks are eligible, it'll start giving them to you, which helps it learn a little faster, right? Because you might go through 200 titles and abstracts and only click 2 or 3 things that are eligible, or that you think are eligible, and it's hard to, the model can't learn very well, right? From that, it needs to have a higher percentage of things that are eligible. But once you get to a certain number that you've screened, maybe 200, 300 that you're screening. And keep in mind, you're just reading the title and abstract. You can often go pretty quickly. Uh, if I've got enough tea brewed, I can usually get through, and I'm focused, I can get through about 1,000 titles and abstracts in a day. So as a benchmark, right? Some of my grad students are considerably slower. But if you have, and this wouldn't be unreasonable, 10,000 hits, right? That's 10 full days of work for one coder, and so that's 20 full days of work for 2 coders. And that's if they're fast. My grad students are often a bit slower. So the AI can really help with that. And it can also help with, one of the big problems with this is attention, right? Your attention starts to fade, and you're not paying as close of attention, and you might make mistakes at that point. And so by having it sort the things so that you're getting the stuff that's most relevant, that really helps keep your attention. But then the question becomes, at what point do you sort of abandon it? These models keep getting better and better, and so I think that their usefulness is going to increase.